them all what I'm made up. Strut down the hall, won't stop till I get enough.
Okay, so we've got this pretty big story developing right now with the Trump administration and the courts. And it's all over immigration. And it involves something you don't hear about every day. The administration is actually using the state secrets privilege.
Yeah, this is one of those things that, you know, it sounds like it's straight out of a, you know, like a spy movie or something.
Exactly.
But it's really a fundamental legal concept, and it gets to the heart of, you know, how much power the executive branch has versus, you know, the role of the courts and, you know, individual rights. Yeah.
So for this deep dive, we're going to really focus in on a specific case that really kind of highlights this whole battle that's going on.
Right.
And it has to do with the Trump administration's decision to deport Venezuelan migrants to El Salvador.
Right.
And they're using something called the Alien Enemies Act to do this.
Yeah.
And this has sparked a lot of legal challenges, which we're going to get into.
Yeah, and we have a great article here from CBS News that kind of lays out all the details.
Yeah.
You know, the recent appeals court hearing and all the legal back and forth. So it's a really fascinating case.
Absolutely.
And what we really want to do today is kind of cut through all the legal jargon and help you, the listener, really understand, you know, what are the core arguments here?
Right.
What is this Alien Enemies Act all about?
Right.
Where does it come from? And you know, what are the implications of what the administration is doing?
Okay, so let's jump right into it.
Okay.
We have a U.S. District Judge James Boasberg who ordered a halt to these deportation flights.
Right.
And he even said they should be reversed.
Right.
And his main concern was about something called due process.
Right.
And specifically for these individuals who were being accused of being gang members.
Yeah. And I think it's helpful for listeners, you know, when we talk about due process, what we're really talking about is the idea that the government has to follow certain rules and procedures to ensure that people's rights are being protected.
Right.
So you can't just, you know, accuse someone of something and then deport them without giving them a chance to, you know, respond to those accusations.
Exactly.
And that's what Judge Boasberg was really concerned about here. He didn't think that these individuals were being given a fair chance to challenge, you know, these pretty serious allegations of gang membership.
Right. And the administration's response was even more surprising. I mean, they actually refused to provide him with some pretty basic information.
Yeah.
Like, when did these planes land?
Right.
Who was on them? And they cited the state secrets privilege.
Yeah, this is the part that's, you know, I think really kind of mind-blowing for a lot of people because it's like, you know, what could be so secret about when a plane landed? But the administration is arguing that, you know, revealing this information could harm diplomatic relations or national security.
Right.
So it's a really high bar that they're setting, and the court is obviously, you know, pushing back on that.
So this led to a pretty interesting appeals court hearing. And the judges seemed pretty divided on how to approach this.
Right.
One of the judges, Judge Patricia Millett, she made a really stark comparison. She said that Nazis who were detained in the U.S. during World War II actually received better legal treatment than these Venezuelan migrants.
Wow.
Who were being deported under this Alien Enemies Act.
That's a very powerful statement.
Yeah.
I mean, I think what's so striking about that comparison is it really forces us to think about, you know, are we using this law in a way that's even more extreme than how we treated literal enemies of the state during wartime?
Right.
And you know, the Justice Department attorney, they pushed back on that. They said, we certainly dispute the Nazi analogy.
Right.
But, you know, even though they disputed it, it doesn't really address the core issue that Judge Millett is raising, which is, you know, are we providing these individuals with basic fairness and due process? Yeah,
and then we had another judge, Judge Justin Walker, who seemed to be more sympathetic to the administration's position, and he raised a procedural question.
Right.
He said, you know, maybe this whole lawsuit should have been filed in Texas.
Right.
Because that's where the migrants were initially detained. And he actually asked the ACLU attorney who was arguing the case.
Yeah.
He said, you could have filed the exact same complaint you filed here in Texas District Court.
Right. So what he's getting at there is a really important legal concept called jurisdiction. And basically it means that, you know, not every court can hear every case.
Right.
You have to file your lawsuit in the right place. And so the administration is basically saying, look, this lawsuit was filed in the wrong court. It should have been filed in Texas, and therefore, the D.C. court doesn't have the authority to hear it.
And the ACLU attorney had a pretty interesting response to that.
Yeah.
He basically said, we have no idea if everyone is in Texas.
Right.
And he argued that the whole deportation process had been conducted in secret.
Right. And I think that really highlights, the concerns about due process here. Because if you don't even know where these people are being held,
right,
how can they possibly, mount a legal challenge for their detention or to their deportation?
Yeah, and it's worth pointing out that there was a third judge on this panel, Karen LaCraft Henderson.
Okay.
And she didn't ask any questions at all.
Interesting.
So, it kind of suggests that maybe she's still on the fence, or
could be,
or maybe she just thinks it's such a complex issue that, she needs more time to think it through.
Exactly.
Okay, so let's step back for a minute and talk about the history behind this Alien Enemies Act.
Okay.
Because this is not a new law.
No, not at all.
It was actually passed in 1798.
1798. That's a long time ago.
I know, that's not a typo.
Wow.
1798.
And what's amazing is that it hasn't been used since World War II.
Yeah.
So for it to suddenly reappear now is really kind of remarkable.
Yeah, and it's interesting because the way they're justifying the use of this law is by saying that this gang, the Tren de Aragua gang, is an invading force.
Right.
That's the language that President Trump has used. And so they're basically saying that this is a national security threat.
Right. And that's a very deliberate choice of words, right?
Yeah.
Because by framing it as an invasion, they're trying to invoke this idea of war,
right,
which is what this Alien Enemies Act was originally intended for.
Right.
So it's a way of kind of, shoehorning this modern day immigration issue
into this very old legal framework that was really designed for a completely different time.
Yeah, right. So let's kind of recap some of the main legal arguments that were presented in court.
Okay.
The government attorney, Drew Ensign, he argued that Judge Boasberg's ruling was a huge intrusion on the power of the executive branch.
Yeah, and that's a really key point, right? It goes to the heart of, what are the powers of the president?
Right.
Yeah. How much authority does he have?
Right.
And how much can the courts interfere with that?
And Judge Millett pushed back on that pretty strongly. She said, the president has to comply with the Constitution and the laws like anyone else.
Right.
So she's basically saying, you can't just claim executive power and do whatever you want.
Exactly. The president is not above the law.
Right.
And that's a really important principle that the courts are upholding here.
And then the ACLU attorney, Lee Gellert, he accused the administration of trying to short-circuit the normal immigration process. Right.
And he said that they were doing all of this in secret.
Yeah, and that goes back to, that fundamental concern about due process. Are these individuals being given a fair chance to be heard?
Right.
And if the whole process is shrouded in secrecy, then, it's very hard to ensure that that's actually happening.
And Judge Walker, as we mentioned earlier, he kind of questioned whether there were any legal precedents that would allow the courts to block what he called a national security operation with foreign implications. So he's basically saying, maybe the court shouldn't be interfering with this at all.
Right. He's suggesting that there's a higher level of deference that needs to be given to the executive branch when it comes to these kinds of national security matters.
Okay, so let's circle back to Judge Boasberg's original ruling. He said that these immigrants who are facing deportation, they have to have a chance to challenge the allegation that they're gang members. Right. And he gave a couple of reasons for that. He said there's a strong public interest in preventing people from being deported by mistake.
Right.
Based on accusations that they can't even challenge.
Yeah, you don't want to deport someone just because, someone labeled them as a gang member without giving them a chance to prove that that's not true.
Exactly.
So accuracy is really important here.
Yeah, and he also said that, the government has to comply with the law.
Right.
He said the public also has a significant stake in the government's compliance with the law. Yeah,
and that's a fundamental principle of our democracy. The government is not above the law. They have to follow the rules just like everyone else.
So this whole situation is actually kind of blown up into a pretty big political controversy. President Trump and some of his allies have called for Judge Boasberg to be impeached.
Wow.
And President Trump himself went on social media and said that Judge Boasberg should be disbarred.
So he's basically saying that this judge shouldn't even be allowed to practice law anymore.
Yeah.
And that's a pretty extreme thing for a president to say.
It is.
And it's really unusual to see a president attack a judge so directly.
Mm-hmm.
It raises concerns about, the separation of powers.
Right.
And whether the president is trying to influence the judiciary.
Yeah, and it was actually so concerning that the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, John Roberts, he actually issued a statement defending Judge Boasberg.
Wow.
And he said that impeachment is not an appropriate response to disagreement concerning a judicial decision.
Right. He's basically saying, look, you can disagree with a judge's ruling, but that doesn't mean that they should be impeached.
Right.
Impeachment is a very serious process.
Yeah.
And it's not something that should be used lightly.
And it's really rare to see the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court kind of weigh in on a political controversy like this.
Yeah. It shows how seriously they're taking this attack on the judiciary.
Yeah. All right, so just to kind of wrap things up, the article mentions that Judge Boasberg wants to investigate whether the government actually defied his initial order to turn the planes around.
Right.
Because apparently he gave that order orally before he issued the written order.
Right.
And the Justice Department is saying, well, no. It was only the written order that mattered. And by the time the written order was issued, the planes had already taken off.
So it's a bit of a technicality, but it could be a really important one because it gets to the question of, did the government disobey a court order?
Right.
Even if it was just an oral order.
And if they did, what are the consequences of that?
Right.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I think the big question here is, how do we balance national security concerns with the rights of individuals?
Right.
Even if those individuals are not U.S. citizens.
And it really makes you think about this Alien Enemies Act. This law was written over 200 years ago for a very different time. Is it really appropriate to be using it today?
Yeah.
In this context of immigration?
And what does it say about, our values as a country? If we're willing to use this kind of extreme measure,
right,
against people who are just seeking a better life.
And the fact that the administration is invoking state secrets,
right?
It makes you wonder, what else are they not telling us?
Exactly what other information is being hidden. And how did that affect our ability to hold the government accountable?
Right.
It's a really important question to think about.
Yeah, it is. So
that's it for our deep dive today.
Thanks for listening.
We hope you found it informative, and we'll see you next time.
See ya.
Bye-bye.
Sound the alarm. I'm coming up. We'll have the ball. I'm sweet like a buttercup. You're Bobby doll. Show them all what I'm made of. Strut down the hall. Won't stop till I